Hi, this is Rick Wilson, and welcome to Dragonproof. You know, if there's anything about 2020 that I think I'll recall when I look back on it, as time goes on, you sort of forget a lot of the bad stuff. And what I think I'll recall most about 2020 isn't the tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy of the year. It'll probably be how quick things changed. That it was a year of where a week felt like a month or a year in and of itself. And this particular week, the big news is that in theory, the FDA is going to approve the Pfizer vaccine for COVID-19 this Friday. And that is going to trigger one of the greatest logistical challenges in mankind's history, where we need to move over the next year-ish billions of doses in a safe manner and distribute it to people by priority of need. That's going to change based on country and region and those doing the assessments. And so logistics is really the next thing for 2020. And the reason I'm talking about it here today is logistics are really one of the cornerstones to successful e-commerce. To succeed in e-commerce, you have to do a lot of things. You have to have a product people want to buy. You have to have clever marketing that can get people's attention. But arguably more important than anything else is you have to have great logistics. You have to be able to deliver products in a timely manner and an affordable way. You have to process returns. And so selling goods online is nowhere as important as delivering these life-saving products, but we can learn from each other. As many of you know, I've been a big fan and participant at the Burning Man project, festival, whatever you want to call it, for the last 21 years. And I've read great articles about that as well, where people who are master logisticians go to Burning Man just to study the logistics of how you build a temporary city in a desert. And I think e-commerce, the vaccine, the military, and to some extent Burning Man all play off this thing. You need to be efficient with your choices and your time, because right now it's a major challenge for humanity, and we have the know-how to solve it. So last time on our year in review, we talked about the first half of the year. There was a time of a lot of things, mostly uncertainty, some chaos, some fear. But in our business, we saw an industry that learned and evolved very rapidly. And it's developed excellent strategies to make the best of a tough situation. So now for the second half of our year in review, I'm joined again by my producer, Chris. So Chris, why don't you get us up to speed with the context for July through September of 2020?
Hey, Rick. So within a hectic year, this was an especially gloomy and chaotic time. We had California fires that were filling the air with smoke. We had a global protest movement that had spilled over into every state and every country in the world. We had over 1,500 COVID deaths per day in the U.S. We had major bankruptcies announced from many retail giants, one after another, many who had been stalwarts for most of our lives. And of course, the political show unfurling in the march towards the election. So quite a backdrop of the world outside of online. Online, it was a different story. If we had thought about the first two quarters as representing uncertainty and then maybe adaptation, we definitely were moving into a new phase with how we are operating online as businesses in the third part of the year.
I definitely think coming into the third quarter, the theme really for e-commerce specifically became innovation.
But what's the difference between adapting and innovating?
Adaptability is fundamentally reactive. You're reacting to your situation that's right in front of you. If you can't ship something via the U.S. Postal Service, you may adapt and use UPS to get your products delivered. That's adaptability. I wouldn't call that an innovation. Innovation is taking that information you've gotten from the uncertainty and the adaptability and actually figuring out a new way to do something. That's the mother of necessity, if you will, is innovation. And so you let the problem guide you to a new solution. And, going back to the mother of necessity cliche, crises tend to drive innovation and they define leadership.
So obviously one of the biggest crises that we were all talking about in July of this year was the continued social justice movement that was everywhere and that had really affected businesses as well. Certainly in how they spoke about what was going on. But in this theme of innovation, it went beyond just identifying a problem and became about, well, how do you deal with this in a new way, not just as a business, but as a person? And to that end, we brought Maureen Benson onto the podcast to chat with you.
Yeah, Chris. At the end of June, the effect of the protests, it was profound. It was profound on businesses, and it was profound on me personally. I've shared a lot of my personal stuff and growth this year on this podcast, and it was just a time of immense reflection for me about things was proud of I had done in my life and things I wanted to evolve and improve on. And so I spoke with activist and educator Maureen Benson about self-work around the issues of social justice and how that creates a healthier workspace. So let's listen to a quick clip. This was something that came up for us this week. So, we made a donation as a company to Black Girls Code, right? Because we want specifically we want STEM coding and education for people of color, especially women, because we have a diversity problem, which I've acknowledged before. And I've been generally taking the stance that I speak about it personally. I talk about MIVA as a loose collection of people, and I will give you my opinion. But how should a business talk about this publicly, regardless of what they're doing internally? Yes, but especially if they've taken some strong internal actions. How do they not come off pandering and or tone deaf?
Well, I wish there was a binder to end racism.
Totally. Of course.
Part of the work is showing up and making your statements and doing your best to be inclusive. And so I appreciate the mindfulness of how can we contribute to address the inequities in educational opportunities, particularly for Black women and non-Black women of color, particularly in the tech world. Then there's the work of your institution, of the culture, right? So when you say I have a diversity problem, it's both your pipeline, but also, is my organization welcoming and not harmful to people of color, right?
Correct.
And that's its own many, many, many years of work. So that's one. Then secondarily, you're going to make statements, and there are going to be statements that you can do your best to have folks who have a different lens, who have experienced racism and oppression, give it a look. And sometimes it's going to land really well, and sometimes it's not. But I think that the third layer of work, in addition to the cultural work and the pipeline work, is how do I show up when I make a mistake? And I think there's a big fear of cancel culture, right? Where people are like, well, let me just not say anything because I'll just get dragged. But actually, the short answer is this. Wow, I now see what I didn't see before. I'm sorry. You can count on me to do better.
So, Rick, can an old dog learn new tricks?
I think so. I mean, I'm trying to, and I'm definitely an old dog at this point. But I mean, I think there's a lot to be said on that subject. So the ability to learn new tricks, as you call it, is dependent on your commitment to personal growth. Self-reflection is the secret to learning new tricks. Youth is not that secret. Now, I do think that when you're young, you have a lot of gaps in your mind to fill in. You have a lot of things you haven't come to conclusions on. And so that's why I think there's this perception that people are learning stuff easier at that age. And I don't mean learning like a language. Yes, learning a language would be harder for me now than it would have been at 7. But I think self-reflection, that's a skill that ages well. If you can do that and you can really hone that in, it ages well. And ultimately, innovation in the marketplace is driven by changing the way you look at yourself and the world. You think about... Here's an example of something that's interesting to me. So Tim Cook, CEO of the most successful company in the history of mankind, famously, I can't remember when this happened. It was probably a year or two ago. It was pre-2020. So Tim Cook came out as a gay man. It had been a fairly widely known, for lack of a better term, secret in the tech community that he was a gay man. But he came out and thinking about the brave choice that was. Here's the CEO of the biggest company in the world when that had been considered a taboo thing to do. But not only did he come out and acknowledge that and create a safer place for people to express who they are, he also has focused the resources of Apple significantly to offer Product Red products throughout the company. And so if you don't know what Product Red is a nonprofit that's designed to raise money for AIDS. Not for AIDS, but to help combat AIDS. And so Tim Cook not only created a safer place for his peers and his subordinates and people well beyond Apple, he's also used the marketing muscle of Apple to raise social consciousness about the AIDS pandemic, a different pandemic, but just as serious, and help try to solve that problem. And I think all of those things come from self-reflection. Had Tim not sat around questioning why he had not made this public statement, and ultimately coming to a new conclusion, he would likely still just let it be a known secret and stayed quiet. And I think that's how you create, I guess I would call it, personal innovation.
It's interesting because companies also need to do the same kind of work.
Companies are fallible, and companies require self-reflection. Now, the self-reflection in a company needs to come as a rule of thumb from the leaders of that company, right? It's kind of not possible for a company is not in and of itself sentient, so it can't have its own self-reflection. But leaders who are being good stewards of a company are constantly reflecting on how that company is showing up in the marketplace, and what it can do to shift that. And talked about this in the episode with John Lawson, but Nike, and granted, you could argue that Nike was they got some marketing zhuzh out of the Kaepernick stuff, but I would say on the whole, Nike didn't really need any marketing zhuzh. Nike was going to do just fine either way, and standing with Kaepernick was a relatively bold choice for a company like that.
It's interesting because the marketing of a company, or the speaking of the company, is where a lot of this self-reflection not only gets expressed, but is defined for the public. And we certainly saw this year a huge challenge, like for marketers to not just stay non-tone deaf and aware of the tone in the room, but they also had to lead and create messaging that was innovative in a time that had challenges which we'd never faced before as online marketers. And so to that end, we brought in another friend of ours, Mark Vila, to talk about marketing.
Yep. So let's listen to Mark for a second, and we'll be right back.
This is one of those things that happens when I think if you're an artist or a marketer, which I kind of think of us being cousins, artists and marketers, that you get inspired all of a sudden by something. So I'll give you a brief story of how I was inspired and then kind of what the solution is. So I had a neighbor down the road, and we're talking about, we get these weird ants here that are invasive species, right? And they are just, it's the weirdest thing. Nothing, you can't get rid of them. Right? You can't get rid of them. There's just, you're bound to have millions of them. You can only control them. So we're talking about, he said, how do I get these out of my house? And then we're talking about different things. And he's talking about, and I got snakes that I saw in my yard, and I was just a snake in my garage. We're talking about all these pests per se invading his home. And I said, well, I'm not having all of those problems. I said, but let me ask you, have you actually gone through your house and done kind of just like a basic pests prevention? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, check all the cracks in your doors, seal anything up. If you have a hole in the side of your house, fix it. If there's a dirt hole, fill it. I said, just basic, so stuff can't get in. And I said, because when you do that, then when the ants come or the snakes come, you're just dealing with one problem. And so anyway, that kind of gave me this inspiration of how I've always thought of marketing and how I do it, right? Is that marketing needs to be this all-encompassing concept of how you're treating your business and what you're doing. And then when crises come, when big changes come, because a big change that's good can be just as straining on a marketing department as a crisis.
Interesting distinction there that I'd love for you to get a little deeper into it. And Mark, by the way, is the director of marketing for Coleman & Company. We forgot to ID him. So what's the difference between fixing old problems, kind of like plastering over the cracks in the foundation in the analogy he gave, but versus creating new solutions? Is that just a semantic difference, or are we again getting at the difference between adapting and innovating here?
I think we're fundamentally at the difference between adapting and innovating, right? So, and as an entrepreneur and a business person who's trying to, if you will, skate to where the puck is going, not to where the puck is, it can be a challenging thing to straddle, right? So, I know if to Amoeba, I could spend the next 5 to 10 years refining things that currently exist within Amoeba. I could almost like someone with OCD who's trying to make their house perfect or any other thing that you're trying to bring to the most minute detail. You can really just keep refining and refining and refining on what I would call old problems. And to some extent, there's some great things there. But really, what you want to do that's sort of adapting. Where innovation comes into this is to the extent that you can take what you've learned from the old problems and invent a new way to perceive of it or a new way to move forward. That's where innovation lives.
Do you think like a company like Sears, which may they rest in peace, should Sears have spent the last 10 years recognizing that the tides were changing and transforming themselves into an online first business versus trying desperately to keep, their real estate based business afloat against a tide that they would never beat? Like, is that an example of failing that challenge?
Yeah, in many ways it is. I mean, someone could get a PhD on studying the rise and fall of Sears for sure. And I'm not only am I not qualified for that PhD where I sit today, at least not about Sears, I don't have enough time to even dig into that. But what I would say is this: Sears took its eye off the ball if you think of them as a business that's job was to create a pleasant, efficient, meaningful way to provide products, a multitude of products to consumers, they stopped fulfilling that mission, I think you could argue, back in the 80s, right? And Walmart saw that they had walked from that mission, so to speak. I think they're somewhat analogous to General Motors in the 80s as well. They had taken their position of success for granted, and they had started getting down the financial engineering block. And that's when you start, they effectively turned from a retailer into a real estate investment trust. And when you stop doing the thing you do for a living, it's inevitably an amount of time before you go bankrupt, which is ultimately what happened there. Where if you look at Walmart, I think Walmart is a great counterexample to that. Now, Amazon is still the winner as far as overall e-commerce sales, but not only is Walmart not just sitting back and leveraging its real estate or any other assets it has, Walmart is actively and competing in e-commerce in a way to give Amazon a run for its money. Walmart's e-commerce experience is far superior today than it was a year ago. I'm not a big Walmart shopper per se. I was always more of a Target guy, and Target's also doing well too. They don't have kind of the heft of Walmart, but these companies are taking these kind of evolutions seriously, and they're not giving up against Amazon. They're not losing their focus, and I think that's a great case study where Walmart and Target are heading to compete with the new of new dragons. Sears rested on its laurels and got its ass kicked.
And really, this year ended up being kind of a microcosm, like for this larger decades-long story of the move from physical to online. Like 2020 was that on steroids.
Oh, I was gonna say that reminds me a little bit of, I'm trying to remember what year this was. I think it was probably 2012 maybe, or 2014. It wasn't long ago that Google decided, long ago in the internet time, but not long ago in real time. This is very specific to e-commerce. It wasn't long ago that Google decided that it was gonna use as a ranking signal whether you had a mobily optimized website. This was before anyone was really shopping with their phone, and it's funny to say that where I sit in 2020. I know now from the stats of our customers, 50-60% of shopping happens on a mobile device, but 6 years ago it was sub 10%. And Google facilitated that disruption by saying, hey, if you don't have a mobily optimized site following these guidelines, we are not going to rank you. And we called it Mobilegeddon. And it was a disruption that happened. And for people who adapted to it and innovated, they started that was the genesis of what we now call a mobile first experience. And that fundamentally changed e-commerce. And I think, that was one action by one dragon, Google, that changed the industry. 2020 is an orchestra of actions by all of the dragons, including Mother Nature.
So it's really incumbent on us to recognize those opportunities as they pop up in real time. And to that end, you gave a solo talk on the show towards the end of July that we called Strategic Opportunities.
Yeah. So let's listen to that clip and we'll jump back in. I believe ultimately priority one when you're in this situation of uncertainty like this as a leader is to, what's the phrase, shore up the boat. So yeah, your first job is to provide safety for both your troops as well as protect the business, and do everything in your power to be prudent and make sure the business is going to survive this for the long haul. And then, from there, you work on the next steps. Once you get all that done and you have your business shored up, that's your time to look for strategic opportunities. And so those could vary a lot, right? So you're going to have new market opportunities, right? We've seen some of our customers convert into, as I discussed in last week's podcast, selling supplies to make masks, right? Where they were previously just selling sewing patterns for other stuff. In the tech world, there might be opportunities for mergers or acquisitions. There might be, you might realize there's new expansions to your product that your customers need because of a new world order. I mean, one example is that, we released 2 new updates to Miva recently that are free for our customers that allow for scheduled deliveries, scheduled pickups, as well as minimum and maximum quantity purchases. And in the old days, I used to laugh, why would you want to limit a maximum quantity? But in a world where, they're rationing meat and toilet paper, you need to be able to issue a maximum quantity. And so it was little things like that that wasn't a huge opportunity for us, but it was a strategic move. And those are the kind of opportunities you can look for at any point to try to both protect your business and grow your business.
So I want to bust you a little bit on something that has come up a lot, and which is, on the one hand, we ask businesses and business leaders to be prudent in their thinking, right? And on the other hand, we ask them to always be on the lookout for strategic opportunities and always be looking to grow, evolve, expand. How do we resolve the tension between those two things?
That's a truly exceptional question. Prudence does not mean being conservative. So I'll start with that. So prudence means being, I guess, for lack of a better description, it's sober awareness, right? So I wasn't going to touch on anything political this particular week, but the White House has not been prudent with its response to COVID-19, having holiday parties without masks and having what may turn out to be their 6th or 7th set of super spreader events. Rudy Giuliani single-handedly closing down the Arizona legislature for a week. Those are perfect examples of non-prudence. But being conservative, but also to combat something like COVID, I don't have to live in a bubble, right? There is a balancing act between following precautions and being safe. And so prudence is really about a sober awareness. Innovation is fundamentally possible by identifying and seizing opportunities. And I think that even goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with self-reflection. Self-reflection is, it's not that different than when you wake up at 4 a.m. with a great idea, or you're in the shower and you have your best creative thinking. Self-reflection is your mind just processing and giving you information. And I think that is how you seize opportunities. And if you can create a space to be quiet and be aware properly, then you can truly seize innovation, and they are not in conflict at all. So let's move on to the last quarter of the year. Chris, why don't you set up the context for this period?
Okay, sure. So as we move into the fall, we start to see wave after wave of quote reopenings happening in different regions of the country with all different levels of severity and rules. And we also, along with those, started to see pretty substantial counter protests to any kind of health guidelines that have made those reopenings possible versus people who don't want anything to be reopened. And it's just been a real shitstorm. Also, during this same quarter, if you can believe it, we had the 2020 election. It already seems like months ago, but it really was just a few weeks ago.
Less than 5. I think. Well, 5. No, today's Tuesday, right? It was 5 weeks ago today.
5 weeks ago today, and we're still rolling through the highly unresolved fallout from a resolved election. which is unnerving to say the least. Meanwhile, the virus has continued to explode in all different parts of America, and we crossed another horrible landmark of 250,000 people who had lost their lives to it, which mostly brings us up to date, except for that one beautiful piece of news that also came during this quarter, which was the announcement of the vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the things you listed are generally terrible disruptions. They are not what we want to go through. And I certainly am not trying to be glib or happy about those things. This has been a year of immense suffering. I was talking to my childhood best friend yesterday, who I've been friends with now for 38 years, and him and his wife both are currently recovering from COVID, and he's been in the middle of a house remodel, and three of the people working on the house with them all got it, and one of the people who got it is 62 years old and is currently in the hospital and has had a stroke and can't move the left side of his body. So this has been just a ridiculously painful year, and I don't want to downplay that, but it's during those times that we are forced to find the good disruptions, to create game changers in the right direction, because all disruption is ultimately a sharpening of the knife, if you will. And so, I spoke with Phil Leahy, the brilliant producer of our recent MivaCon Digital Day. We talked about the rapid shift of business communication technology due to the disruptions of 2020 and the future of in-person events. And Phil is a visionary in e-commerce and a visionary when it comes to events. So here's Phil describing the experience of how vendors use the digital architecture he designed for our event.
People need to talk and share. And obviously we can't do that because of the restraints on physical get-togethers. We want to see companies promote a solid program of touch points, whether it's once a month or once every 3 months with their base.
How much of this is trying to recreate the physical experience, the physical interaction, and what's necessary now?
Yeah, I guess it is. It's trying to also create a bit of that physical. Like we used our exhibition rooms for your show, which was the first time. It was new technology. We spent 3 months working out what we're going to use. And I went around to each booth and dropped in and saw how things were going. And some companies were doing it really well. They had, 4 or 5 of their own people there. They started conversations with people and they said, well, let's take that into a breakout room. So they'd take them away from the main stand into a room and then talk. It was interesting to see that, when you arrived in the room, we could actually play a video to them. One company did that, and it was a great experience. It was like a 15-second video before you got into the room. And then you came to a white board, which would basically, you could put a tile there, but it was basically your messaging. I went into one room and they had all these graphs up and all that. I'm like, sorry guys, what do you do? And they say, oh, we lend money to merchants. And I went, how about you just put up a slide? We lend money to merchants and ask me how.
Yeah.
So it's experience and looking at these things. And I think as we go along, we're going to learn more about that and pass that on.
So there's really no better example of what we would call a good disruption this year than this explosion of the use of video conferencing for business communication, and then, as Phil was talking about, for in-person events. It's also kind of a great story of a disruptor. In this case, I guess Zoom really leads the charge here in this storyline, offering such an innovation, something so much better than what came before, that it essentially, like overnight, became the new dragon, and led the way for the kinds of events that Phil produced for Miva. So this ended up being a great disruption for the public, maybe not so great for Skype.
Well, Skype's doing just fine as part of Microsoft, and it's sort of the backbone of Microsoft Teams, which is, we can discuss Slack and Teams on another podcast episode in 2020.
Is Teams happening? I thought Teams was...
Teams is out there.
Teams was a dud. No?
Well, it kind of sucks, but it's it sucks from a product standpoint, but it has something like 8 times more daily users than Slack. But that's neither here nor there. Let's focus on Zoom for a second. And I think the takeaway there is disruptions always lead to innovations. Today's disruptors always become, or I shouldn't say always, just because you disrupt doesn't mean you become a dragon. But if you want to know who's going to be a dragon, look at who's disrupting today. And this sort of reminds me of something. If I had to explain, if a 10-year-old child asked me to explain what it means to be an entrepreneur, I think we can sometimes make these things really simple, which is I would tell someone, think about something you wish existed that you don't have access to today, and then figure out how to invent it. And that is where disruption turns into innovation. And so I think, it can sometimes be as simple as that. And Zoom was in the right place at the right time. And they had something like 7 years worth of growth in like 3 months. So good on them for not collapsing. So in September, I decided to flex some of the freedom of work from home, and I took an extended working road trip. And I did podcasts all along the way. So let's listen to that here real quick.
It's actually, once you get your RV legs back, and this whole idea of not just this being a vacation, but being able to work from wherever I was, you get set up, and you make sure you have access to power or your generator, and you have your internet's decent. And then, you find a groove. I had my whole laptop set up on my little dining room table, and I was able to just work. And some of the most productive days I've had in the last 6 months happened in that RV over the last 9 days, 10 days. But for business owners and people who listen to this podcast and people who are aspiring to dragon-proof their lives, being stuck, really the way you get unstuck is having a paradigm shift. And a paradigm shift can come in an hour if you go to a new park you've never been to and set up a picnic and lay there and stare at the sky and journal or talk to a friend. I mean, it really is just about shifting perspective more than it was the toyness of an RV or the ability to travel through 3 or 4 states. So I think that the first tip I would give is find an hour or two and go do something that is totally outside of your routine that causes you relaxation and joy.
I think the reason that we really liked talking about this trip so much, why it was so interesting, we did spend a good amount of time on it in the early fall, was because it's such a great metaphor for the kind of good disruption that we're talking about. And what I want to know is, when you're running a shop, when you're running a company, how much latitude do you even actually have to be somewhat of a maverick or experimental in how you work? I'm not even talking about your business model or how you're dealing with the outside world, but within. Can you be disruptive in your own organization?
I would argue that you have to be. And it can be a very fine line, right? So I'm sure those listening, since you know about e-commerce, heard the very, very tragic news of Tony Hsieh passing away this last week. And he was a disruptor within his own organization for his entire career. His 20 years at Zappos, he constantly disrupted. Most of those disruptions were good, but he had some that were bad. And I think that, his holacracy thing was probably the most famous failure of his disruptions, where I think 1/6 of his staff quit. But that's neither here nor there. Tony was a visionary and a leader and a really brilliant mind. And he was someone who I would say constantly focused on disrupting what he had already built. And I think the way to do that intelligently is self-reflection, mindfulness, going back to my clip from just a second ago, shift your perspective. And I think if you don't, now by being a maverick, I don't mean that tomorrow a few years ago, someone famously changed everyone's salary in their business to the same salary their position was. And it was a payments company. And I don't know that much about the story, so I don't want to opine too much, but that always struck me as a marketing thing. And apparently there was some politics behind the scene with him and his brother and blah, blah, blah. So I don't mean go and do radical things that aren't based on self-reflection and innovation. But if you can have self-reflection, if you can really see where the market's going, and that requires a discipline that sounds easy on paper or on a podcast, but is really an intense amount of work. It's not that different than meditation. Meditating sounds so easy. Sit there quietly. I challenge anyone who's never meditated to go do it for just 10 minutes and see what your mind does to you for the next 10 minutes. So in October, our attention was focused on the upcoming holiday shopping season. And I spoke with Mitch Goldstone of scanmyphotos.com about how he approaches his business plan right now.
Each morning we have a strategy session and we say, let's do this. So whereas whenever I speak to other businesses, they have strategic plans months in advance. Ours is pretty much the morning of. Whatever today's news is what we're focused on. And so tomorrow morning will be something totally different. We don't even know what it is yet. But I think that's the real secret in business, to fire, keep on aiming and seeing what you hit.
Yeah, I really love this clip, and Mitch is so great.
Mitch is for those of you who don't know Mitch, he's a character. You should check out scanmyphotos.com. And if you can find Mitch on YouTube or Twitter, he's well worth it.
So, I mean, I guess the question there is, why don't we just want the status quo forever? I mean, that's really a question for this year. Like, if something has worked for us in the past, why don't we just want to keep going with that? Why should Mitch like change his plans on the fly every morning?
Well, look, I think you're asking a question that comes down to human nature. We all left to a life not reflected upon. That's exactly what we want. We want to be not disrupted. And the fact of the matter is, the reason we can't do that is because conditions will always change. Good disruption, like the upcoming holiday period, it's critical. It's crucial to honing your business. I remember one time when I was a younger man, I've always had lifelong friends. The people I hang out with, largely I've known for 10, 20, 30 years. And a person I went to high school with and had been friends with when I was younger, almost 20 years ago now, we kind of went our separate ways. And during that process, he asked me, I don't know what's wrong. Why don't you want to, why aren't we still hanging out all the time? I'm the same as I've always been. And I had to be polite. But fundamentally, the reason I didn't want to keep spending time with that person was because they were the same person they were when they were 15. And so, think about your own personal life. Would you want to be the same person you were 20 years ago? And my guess is, other than being younger and maybe in better shape, probably not. And the whole point of life is to evolve and grow. And I think business very much mimics the life process there.
Ultimately, not to get too zen here, but I'm
a fan of getting too zen. So
you want to get too zen? Let's do it. Well, what do you say if I say, well, all disruption is good disruption? Yes or no? True, false?
Yeah, yes.
Yep.
Fundamentally, yes.
So,
to steal from Jeff Goldblum, life finds a way.
Life finds a way. It's hard this year to celebrate disruption, right?
Yeah, of course. There's by the time the inauguration happens, we're going to be at 350,000 to 400,000 Americans who are no longer with us. I'm not celebrating that, but I do think the disruptions that happen this year, if we take the discipline and the time to think about them, will lead to a better society in the future. At least that's my hope. I
hope so too. Well, that brings us to the end of our talk about this year. Before you do your outro, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to you, Rick, for a great year of content here, a great year of opinions and ideas. And I love where we've gone with this. Anybody who's listening for the first time, I totally invite you guys to go and check out our little journey over the course of the year. We've learned a lot, grown a lot, and we look forward to what comes next. So thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Chris, very much. You're welcome, by the way. We did make it to the end of our review and almost the end of the year. We have a few weeks to go. This is our final podcast of 2020. We'll be back to you guys in January. There are major challenges ahead, logistics, otherwise, but the storyline is changing now. And there's a lot to be hopeful for. There's ultimately a lot to be grateful for. And next year, we have another couple dozen podcasts coming your way. We might have a new book if we can get it done. We have lots of things to explore and share with you next year. And I encourage you to stay safe, stay engaged, stay hopeful. And I want to thank all of our great guests we talked to this year. And Chris, I want to thank you for being a wonderful producer. Happy New Year, everybody. And I will talk to you in 2021.